Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 144 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are joined by friend of the podcast, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Jerrod has graced the Criminologist podcast more than any other contributor. I cannot begin to describe his subject matter expertise in a variety of forensic-related fields. Today, Jerrod is back to profile yet another infamous serial killer for you all. We have done this in the past with our profiles of John Wayne Gacy, Albert Fish, H.H. Holmes, and John List. If you have not already done so, I encourage you to go back and check out Dr. Brown's previous appearances on the Criminologist podcast. Today, Dr. Brown is going to be sharing his insights and research around infamous serial killer Edmund Kemper. And as we always make clear during these profile episodes, our goal is not to sensationalize these horrific crimes, but rather to make an attempt to learn from them and leverage that collective knowledge moving forward, working with certain populations. Now, some of you may have heard or even be familiar with the subject of this week's profile, Edmund Kemper. But if not, please allow me to give you some background information before we hear from Dr. Brown, who is going to look at this case study through his unique forensic lens. Please know that we are not glamorizing or doing this for shock value, but rather to illustrate his crimes and behavior as a case study for you all to learn from. Before we hear from Jerrod, allow me to give you some historical background on this week's profile. Edmund Emil Kemper III, born December 18th, 1948, is an American serial killer who murdered a total of 10 people, including a 15-year-old girl, as well as his own mother and her best friend, from May of 1972 to April of 1973. Following his parole for murdering his paternal grandparents, Kemper was nicknamed the Co-Ed Killer, as most of his victims were female college students hitchhiking in the vicinity of Santa Cruz County in California. He stands at 6 feet 9 inches tall. Most of his murders included necrophilia, with some incidents of rape. Born in Burbank, California, Kemper had a troubled upbringing. His parents divorced early in life. As a child, he moved to Montana with his mother, who kept Kemper locked in their basement, which had been frequented by rats. He ran away to reunite with his father, but he had remarried around Christmas of 1963 and sent Edmund to stay with his paternal grandparents in North Fork, California. It was there, in August of 1964, at the age of 15, that he murdered them. Following the murders, Kemper was briefly diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia by court psychiatrist and sentenced to a state hospital for the criminally insane juvenile. Released at the age of 21 after convincing psychiatrists he was rehabilitated, Kemper was reportedly regarded as non-threatening by his future victims. he targeted young female hitchhikers during his killing spree, luring them into his vehicle and driving them to secluded areas where he would murder them before taking their corpses back to his home to be decapitated, dismembered, and violated. Kemper then murdered his mother and one of her friends before turning himself in to the authorities. Found sane and guilty at his trial in 1973, Kemper requested the death penalty for his crimes. Capital punishment was suspended in California at that time, and he instead received 8 concurrent life sentences. And now let's hear from the man himself, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Jerrod has been on the show multiple times in the past. By way of brief introduction, I can tell you that Jerrod is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And now, please enjoy this case study of Edmund Kemper, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back to the show, Jerrod, here to profile another serial killer. And I can point out that the plan moving forward, since we've gotten some really good responses when you've done this in the past for the show with the likes of John Wayne Gacy, John List, the plan is to have you back about once a month to profile another one of these high-profile killers. And as we always say, of course, not to glamorize or exploit, but to really leverage those experience for practitioners moving forward. But before we get there, welcome back to the show. Our regular listeners, of course, know who Dr. Jerrod Brown is. But Jerrod, why don't you introduce yourself for some of the newer listeners, and then we'll get into your analysis of Edmund Kemper.
You bet. Thank you, my good friend, for having me back. Honored to be here. My name is Jerrod Brown, and I am a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant. And a lot of the work that I have been doing recently and hopefully all throughout 2022 or 23 is going to really focus on the field of neurocriminology. And I've also been doing a lot of work recently on intrafamilial homicides. So really digging into those two topics. And with the neurocriminology topic, I'm really infusing that into a lot of the trainings I do. And when I'm doing these kind of profiles, it really is helping me better understand potentially why some individuals may engage in deviant, problematic, violent, dangerous, confusing, and concerning behaviors. And like Joe said, we profiled a handful of other serial killers, and we're looking at doing one high-profile serial killer on average once a month. And again, our goal with this, like Joe said, is really not to sensationalize these cases. So I'm not going to go like deep in the weeds with actually how these killers carried out their deviant acts. We'll talk generally about it, but really using it as a teaching tool, linking some of the behavioral patterns of these individuals to what the current research says, and then talk about general intervention strategies as well is kind of my goal with this.
Outstanding, Jerrod. Outstanding. So why don't we begin with you providing our audience with an overall synopsis of Edward Kemper and his crimes, and then, as noted, we'll do a deeper dive into some of those pathologies and look at it through that forensic lens.
You bet. This is an interesting case, and all the cases we profiled are really interesting and complex. This is interesting because he's actually still alive today, incarcerated. He was born in 1948 in California. He has been referred to as the co-ed killer or the co-ed butcher, you will find several documentaries online about him on YouTube, lots of crime blogs. If you just Google his name, you're going to find all kinds of stuff online. If you go to Google Scholar and type his name, there's actually several articles and studies and dissertations and master's theses that have talked about him directly or indirectly in these articles. So there's a lot of information out there. And there's actually a lot of information we've learned directly from him because he has been interviewed in the past for various programs. He's been interviewed by former FBI profilers. Very fascinating. There's been several books that have mentioned him and talked about him. He was a middle child, only son. His mom was born in 1921. And died in 1973. She died because he murdered her and her friend. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. His father was born in 1919 and died in 1985. There's not a lot we know about his dad. We know that mom and dad divorced. He felt rejected. He went to try to reconnect with his father some years later when he was a teenager, and found out his dad was remarried and just really felt rejected. What we do know that his father was a World War II veteran. What role did that play in parenting? I don't know, but just something to be aware of. He also has one older and one younger sister. Interesting fact just for your audience to be aware of, which doesn't hold a lot of bearing, but when he was born, he was around 13 pounds. Huge baby, huge kid, huge adult. He is a very tall and large gentleman. His crimes took place between 1964 and 1973. For part of that time, he was incarcerated at kind of like a state forensic hospital after he married or after he killed his paternal grandparents. We'll talk about that too. During this span of time, he brutally murdered 10 people, 2 of them being his paternal grandparents, the other 2 being his mother and his mother's friend, and the rest of his victims were female-age college students. His methods of killing were absolutely brutal, many and varied, and we're not going to go into the weeds on how he did it, all that, but he was referred to as a necrophiliac serial killer. He would dismember some of the bodies. We'll talk a little bit about criminal dismemberment today. Rape, decapitation. He would photograph and have sexual intercourse with some of the naked corpses before dismembering them. He choked some of his victims. He fatally shot some of his victims with a .22 caliber pistol. He stabbed some of his victims. He would use a power saw to cut up some of his victims. For some of his victims, he would remove the bullets from the body in his mind to avoid any identification. So that's kind of a broad spectrum overview of his methods of killing. If you go deep in the weeds with his diagnostic history in terms of was he diagnosed with anything, there's some confusion and controversy of what did he really meet diagnostic criteria for. If you look at newspaper accounts, the documentaries, things online, some articles, some resources clearly point out that he had psychopathic traits, and this emerged early on in life. We'll talk about his early life history in a few minutes. Some articles talked about antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, schizoid-typal personality disorder. He was diagnosed early on in his teenage years, early 20s, with paranoid schizophrenia, but that was kind of called into question if that was really accurate. So take that with a grain of salt. Some reports say he was diagnosed with personality traits that were the passive-aggressive type. So it's really all over the map, but we know he was dealing with a number of different factors variables that we need to take into account. Before I get into some of his personality traits and early life history, Joe, any thoughts, questions, anything you'd like to add from your lens?
I appreciate the fact, Jerrod, that you're giving the listener enough details of the offenses to paint an accurate picture without getting too in the weeds as to how ghastly these could be. And I also appreciate you're starting to look at these offenses through your well-polished forensic lens. So yeah, just keep on providing as you're doing those forensic observations, which the current practitioner listener can learn from, essentially.
Yeah, some interesting facts about him, some personality traits, different things just to be aware of. When he was apprehended as an adult, he's 6'9" tall, weighed about 300 pounds. He towered over most people. He has been referred to as highly intelligent and introspective. Take that into account too. Some of the people we profiled, they may have struggled with that on some level. He befriended several local law enforcement officers in the town he lived. He actually wanted to become a police officer, and he would frequent an establishment where law enforcement officers would go after work and hang out. And by all accounts, everything I've learned about him, the documentaries I've watched, things I've read, he was pretty well liked by the law enforcement officers there. He was fascinated by law enforcement. He had a dream of really becoming a law enforcement officer, but everything I know about that history is that he applied to be a law enforcement officer and was rejected because of his height and weight. He wasn't necessarily rejected for his past history, because at that time they didn't know that he actually murdered his grandparents, because those records were expunged. But again, if he was probably offered the job and they went deeper into it, they would have found out and obviously not offered him the job. There is mention that he did struggle with managing money. So he had some problems with financial management. What factors that play into this? Don't know. But when we're working with people that have a long-standing pattern of struggling with managing money, I'm not saying he's dealing with this, but two things pop in my mind. Is there some executive functioning problems going on? Maybe. Could this be rooted in impulse control problems, self-regulation deficits with overspending? Just some variables to take into account that really all criminal justice professionals should consider. He suffered a head injury in adulthood from a motorcycle accident, and by all accounts, he also broke an arm. So now we have a possible head injury on top of all these other things. Now, take this into account. His crimes occurred before he sustained any head injury. But having a head injury sure as heck did not help the situation. By no means am I saying if someone has a head injury, they're going to become a serial killer. Absolutely not. But if we look at least some of the profiles I've done to date, several of them have had documented histories of a head injury from a variety of reasons. And if we look at some of the forensic literature right now, a sizable chunk of folks in prison have head injury histories. But again, the overwhelming majority of people that suffer a head injury are not going to become violent, sadistic serial killers. He had unstable friendships with his peers. He was engaged at one time, but that was called off. And if we look at his early childhood history, this is where it gets interesting, because anytime I profile these kind of cases, we need to look at childhood histories, but backing it up even further. In utero, I am always looking at the prenatal environment. But from these cases I profiled, there is virtually nothing available that talks about prenatal history, because some of these profiles go back years, like when we did Albert Fish. I mean, his case is well over 100 years old, so there's not record of prenatal. So we need to take into account the prenatal history. So with his early childhood history, he displayed psychopathic traits at an early age. He had a history of torturing insects and had a history of cruelty to animals. So take that into account. Again, I am not saying if a child is cruel to animals, they are going to grow up and become a serial killer. By no means am I saying that, but it is something to be aware of. We also know that he had a very dysfunctional relationship with his mother. We definitely want to know about the family dynamic history. So, looking at his history, we'll talk about his mother in just a few minutes. He mentioned in some of the interviews that were done with different profilers that he had a lot of fear and anger growing up. He was a chronic daydreamer. He really struggled to communicate socially and sexually with the opposite sex. So he had some issues talking to females. He had an absolute fantasy and thinking patterns of revenge, particularly against his mother. His mother was very brutal. He had a history of loneliness. Clearly, he was dealing with some severe attachment problems, so very important. Just looking at his case, becoming attachment informed, trauma informed, brain injury informed, again, very, very important. Clearly, he had rage control issues. It seemed, by all accounts, the rage control issues were related to females. And if you dig deeper, it was related to his mother. He had deprived love from his family of origin, so he felt rejected. His parents divorced at an early age. I believe at the age of 13, that's when he ran away from his mother's home to his father's. And at that time, when he ran away to his father, he was hoping to reconnect. But he learned that his father remarried and had a stepchild where his father seemed to possibly like more than Kemper. So Kemper felt very rejected. And at the age of 14, that's when he went to live with his paternal grandparents. A short time after that, a year, a little bit more later, that's when he murdered his paternal grandparents, I believe at the age of 15. And then at that point, he turned himself in. He was cooperative with law enforcement during the arrest and went to kind of like a state forensic kind of psychiatric hospital. There's a few articles that mention that he had a history of being bullied by classmates. A couple other things I want to point out about his childhood that are very unusual. He, at the age of 10, supposedly buried a cat alive. Once the cat died, dug the cat up, decapitated the cat, and mounted the cat's head on a spike. He also had a tendency to play some make-believe games with one of his sisters, and his two favorite make-believe games were pretending that he was in a gas chamber and in an electric chair, and had his sister like turn on an imaginary switch, and then he would act like he was being electrocuted on the ground. So obviously some strange, concerning behaviors early on in life. He clearly had a dark fantasy life, and from everything I've learned about his case, he's also had 2 near-death experiences as a child. Supposedly his elder sister might have tried to push him in front of a train. There was some mention in some articles. It's tough to know what's accurate or not. Take that with a grain of salt as well. And another time, he almost drowned in a swimming pool. So he had 2 near-death experiences. So these are all traumatic, different things to think about. So a lot of moving parts with him. When we look at his mother, if I were to say what's the biggest factor to take into account with his history, it's his relationship with his mother. It was volatile. She was emotionally abusive by all accounts, domineering. She would frequently belittle him, humiliate him, and there are accounts that she would lock him in a basement for an extended period of time because there might have been some fear in her part that he was going to hurt his sisters. She was possibly diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Some reports mention that. Other reports mention she was an alcoholic. She showed little affection to him. So he had a lot of anger, a lot of resentment over many year period of time. Now, I don't know what the prenatal history was like. that would be an area I would love to know more about. What was going on when she was pregnant with him? Was she taking care of herself prenatally? Was she using any substances? What was the relationship like with the father? That's very important. But again, let's say there was some trauma happening in utero. That doesn't explain why he grew up to do these things. It's usually a combination of neurological, biological, social, family factors, sometimes genetic factors that converge all at the right time and can be a recipe for disaster. Joe, I'm going to park the brakes there for a second, see if you have any thoughts, and then I'll get a little bit deeper into some other things about his life.
Well, you already answered or addressed one of my questions, which was the prenatal influences. I know in the past when we've talked, not just on serial killers, Jerrod, but on criminal trajectories in general, you've coached me on, hey, we need to look at everything up to including those prenatal influences. Otherwise, what I'm hearing are a lot of those traditional, choose my words carefully here, markers or sort of, the usual suspects of trauma, for example, and the early family dysfunction. Any of those other themes, I guess, if you will, that when you survey the landscape of serial killers, you're able to cherry pick out some of those common denominators?
Well, prenatal and postnatal neurobiopsychosocial factors. It's so tough everyone wants to know, why did this happen? You can't point to one reason. Just all the things I listed off with him. Look at all the things that have happened to him early on in life. Look at his family of origin. A lot of factors, and it was probably a multitude of factors that built up and up and up over time. It's not like he just thought about brutally murdering 10 people one day. He probably had years and years of fantasy, rage that has built up. So when you study serial killers, especially sadistic-based homicide serial killers, necrophiliac-based serial killers, look at fantasy development literature. Tons and tons of stuff to support the fact that people that engaged in these behaviors likely had fantasies about it years and years beforehand. We'll talk about triggering events in a few minutes, but with him, some articles talk about he really had an underdeveloped positive sense of self. Well, what was his sense of self like? If he had an underdeveloped sense of self, self-esteem, shame, these kind of things need to be taken into account. Some articles talk about he really had a mixed kind of fascination and hatred for upper middle class females. Where does that come from? His mom, clearly, in my opinion. This stemmed from the rage control issues that he had with his mom. After he got out of that forensic psychiatric hospital, he lived, I believe, on his own for a period of time, but he eventually lived with his mother. And there's some accounts that every time him and his mother ended up having an explosive fight, there are reports that they would yell and scream at each other. This could have been a triggering event because at that point he sometimes went out and would hunt victims and kill people. So that could have been a triggering event, the rage control issues he had with his mother. When we talk about homicidal necrophilia, he engaged in homicidal necrophilia. This is one of many different classifications of necrophilia. I actually wrote a book chapter with some colleagues multiple years ago for a book that focuses on all things necrophilia. Our chapter focused on homicidal necrophilia. I don't even remember how long ago that was. It's probably 8 years ago now. Just a fascinating topic. When you study him, and you study necrophilia through a homicide lens, be aware of the term of necrosadist. This really involves the intentional death of a victim for purposes of sexual gratification with the corpse. So that's kind of what he did in some cases. They can be very destructive to the corpse. So being aware of criminal dismemberment, body dismemberment. The vast majority of homicidal necrophilia offenders are men. Some have had a long history of fantasizing about these behaviors on non-human subjects. So we need to look at, did some of these behaviors come out in the way they treated animals or different objects? Social isolation has been noted to be higher in the histories of people who engage in homicidal necrophilia. Disruptions in early attachment patterns, obsessive interest in viewing pornography, so having a really deep-seated, almost obsessional interest in pornography has been noted. Chronic masturbation has been noted in the histories of some of these individuals. Drug and alcohol problems in some cases. Some of these offenders have had documented brain injury histories, and some have had diagnosis or met diagnostic criteria for a personality disorder. So the causes for necrophilia, again, can be many and varied. It could be an intense fear for talking to living people. They just have an intense fear. And we know from his history, he had a very intense fear of talking to the opposite sex. And I believe in his case, part of why he engaged in these behaviors is to gain a sense of control. So this rage control issues he had about his mom, and they got into a lot of fights, he probably felt out of control in those situations. So doing what he did gave him a sense of feeling back in control. Lack of remorse, having a lack of recognition of social boundaries, and having compulsive sexual interest are just different variables you'd want to take into account when studying like homicidal necrophilia cases. When we think about criminal dismemberment, there's actually a large body of research that's looked at dismemberment of bodies, and the reasons are many and varied. Before I learned about this, I was shocked to learn how many different subtypes there are when we're talking about dismembering a body. There could be defensive mutilation that occurred where the person had that need to conceal the corpse. There's sexual based kinds of criminal dismemberment for sexual gratification. If you go deep into the weeds with this literature, it's really broken down into defensive dismemberment, aggressive dismemberment, offensive dismemberment, necromaniac dismemberment, and communication dismemberment. We don't have time to go into that today, but that could be something we could definitely go into at a later time. He decapitated some of his victims. If you look at the decapitation literature, the reasons for this are also many and varied. You can have decapitation deaths resulting from suicide. Some of the most common suicidal decapitation deaths relate to someone laying on a train tracks and then intentionally being ran over. That's talked about in the literature. There's accidental decapitation deaths, and then there's homicidal-based decapitations. He engaged in, obviously, homicidal decapitation. And when you study these kinds of patterns, looking through like a profiler lens, looking at body disposal kinds of patterns, where did he dispose the body? How? Why? When? Looking at geographic profiling. There's a whole line of literature on that. Fascinating stuff. Posing of the corpses. That's talked about in the sexual homicide literature. Did the offender put the corpse in a certain position to communicate something? That's something to consider as well. Being aware of the topic of crime scene staging. I believe we talked about misopedes in a previous episode, the sadistic homicide offenders of children. In that literature, sometimes those offenders will actually put foreign objects into the mouth or anus or the vaginal cavity of the child. Rocks sometimes, branches, things like that are just horrific for us to think, why is this the case? We also need to be aware of any kind of post-mortem mutilation. So again, he engaged in a lot of post-mortem mutilation. I don't want to go too deep with how he killed his mother, but clearly the way in which he killed his mother demonstrated a high level of rage. He killed her, decapitated her, ended up having intercourse with her skull, kept the body, and put it in her apartment for a period of time. So that is kind of it, I think, Joe, for him directly, but I wanted to spend a little time on kind of linking this back to kind of the research of today. But do you have any other thoughts or questions, anything else I can answer about him directly?
No, you've done a good job of, again, highlighting those behaviors without, as we talked about, exploiting or presenting it in a tantalizing fashion. And then, let's go there. Let's talk about, for the current practitioner. Obviously, Jerrod, we use these extreme cases to illustrate more common occurrences, be it trauma or prenatal issues. So, maybe for the practitioner listening who obviously they're not dealing with an Edmund Kemper, but what are some of those things we can take from the Kemper case and leverage in our supervision and or interactions with our current clients, or just things to be maybe more aware of? For example, you mentioned the obsession with pornography earlier, things of that nature, or again, takeaways.
Well, again, I'm really trying to look at all the work I do now, trainings, consulting, through a neurocriminology lens. So we're looking at biological factors, environmental, neurological. If your audience wants to learn a little bit more about neurocriminology, you and I did a podcast on that. I'd highly encourage them to take a look at that. If you look at the general sexual homicide research, take Kemper out of it, just general sexual homicide research. In that research, it talks about empathy deficits, sexual jealousy. It talks about family instability, psychopathic traits, higher rates of personality disorders. Sexual paraphilia is obviously very common. Rejection histories, poor social and interpersonal skills, emotional loneliness, and inadequate child development. These are all factors to consider, I think, regardless if it's a sexual homicide, serial killer case. Just in general, if you're working with high-risk offenders, important to consider those variables. When you look at the sexual homicide triggering factors research, what could trigger an offender to actually commit one of these kind of crimes, or even just a sexually based homicide? Isolation, rejection, feeling ridiculed, low self-esteem, substance misuse has been noted, fantasy development, unresolved trauma, severe mental health challenges. Are there any predispositional factors that are psychological, biological in nature? Unresolved conflict. These are all things talked about in the sexual homicide triggering literature. For him, I think obviously one of the triggering events was those rage control issues with his mom. He clearly dealt with trauma. So learning about complex trauma, if we just look at general complex trauma literature, kids that are exposed to lots and lots of trauma early on in life, it can negatively impact their biological health, how they manage stress, their attachment, their cognition, and their executive function. It can lead to negative self-perceptions in the individual. So very important to understand complex trauma. Very important, too, to understand the adverse childhood experiences research. Now, again, overwhelming majority of people with childhood traumas don't do these things, but his history clearly indicates he had a lot of trauma. So becoming adverse childhood experiences informed is going to be very helpful. If you look at the AIAFS research, direct experiences of abuse relate to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. Indirect adverse childhood experiences relate to caregiver mental health, caregiver substance use, caregiver incarceration, divorce, and witnessing of domestic violence. Kemper's history had some of them go on. Not all of them, but some. We talked about those today. Kemper clearly dealt with probably some level of toxic stress exposure. Any child that grew up with lots of trauma dealt with just toxic stress exposure. If you look at the general literature on toxic stress exposure, over the long haul, when someone's dealing with high levels of stress, it's been linked to having more negative emotionality, so it could amplify anger. It's been related to more emotional regulation problems. It's been shown to increase cognitive distortions, so poor thinking patterns. It can decrease inhibition. Inhibitions are internal parking brake. It helps us stop, pause, reflect, try to make better decisions. And when we have decreased inhibition, we may be more impulsive. He clearly lived in a chaotic family system. What are some factors associated with a chaotic family environment? Parental abuse, parental neglect, parental abandonment, a child growing up in a home where one or both parents is very frightening or unpredictable or non-responsive, forced separation from a caregiver, living in an unstable living environment, frequent moves, and parents that might have drug or alcohol problems, profound mental health challenges. That's the general literature when we talk about chaotic family systems. When we talk about trauma a little bit more, he clearly dealt with some level of betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma is another form of trauma that some people say is the worst trauma of them all. Betrayal trauma is when the perpetrator is like a very close loved one to you, a parent. He dealt with some level of betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma can damage trust, safety, security. The reactions that people can have as a result of betrayal trauma can cause anxiety and panic attacks, obsessive thinking, negative flashbacks. It can impact physical health, social health. Again, does that explain why he did these things? No, but it is a factor that occurred in his life. So a couple questions to consider through this trauma and attachment lens. The client you're working with now, do they feel valued and respected? Do they feel rejected or shamed or isolated or abandoned or ignored? If your clients have a long-standing history of experiencing those things, it's not going to hurt you to look through a trauma lens. Very, very important. If we look at the child maltreatment literature in relation to interpersonal difficulties, and we talked a little bit about the fact that he had some social skill deficits, had a hard time talking with other people. Child maltreatment literature talks about disrupted attachment patterns, trust issues, poor perspective taking, expectations of harm for other people, and having poor boundaries. And these are all things that can impact attachment patterns as well. I would also recommend your audience to really understand the literature related to humiliation. Humiliation could be a triggering event for some people. Maybe not to go commit a crime, but if someone has a long-standing history of being humiliated, it could shut them down. It could exacerbate sleep problems. It could be a triggering event for a relapse on drugs and alcohol. It could be a factor for suicidal thinking. So looking at any pattern of humiliation. He clearly had a rejection history. Being rejected in childhood is a type of childhood trauma. And then, again, as he got older, this could have been a triggering event. For some people that have had long-standing histories of being rejected as a child, they go inward, and that could be a factor for having a more active inner life and be a factor in more fantasy development. So maybe someone's rejected by peers or their family. They don't feel like the world is safe, so they go inward. So it's harder to connect with that person, but they have a very active inner world. Peer rejection is a type of social trauma. There's some indication that he was bullied and teased. Some of the other killers we profiled, they have had a long-standing history of being bullied and teased. So looking at that literature, I think, is very helpful. We didn't talk about this directly, but I think it's important to alert your audience too to the topic of covert trauma. This is trauma that might not be as obvious to the professional. What are some examples of covert trauma that you want to be aware of in the life histories of the clients you're working with? Not a lot of nonverbal cues maybe that person got growing up by caregivers or other people where they didn't maybe say things directly to them, but it made the person feel really inadequate, where they got the rolling of the eyes, or you could just feel it in their body language, that the nonverbal cues where they were disgusted by that person. differential treatment. So parents seem to favor another child over another child. It sounds like that was the case with Kemper's mom, maybe favored the other siblings. So that's a form of covert trauma. Abandonment, enmeshment, parent-child role reversal, reversing blame, invalidation, minimization. These are all forms of covert trauma to be on the lookout for. With him, I don't know what his level of shame was, but when you're talking about general literature on all these topics, there's a high likelihood that they're probably dealing with some level of shame. So they might feel trapped or incompetent or defective, or they just feel unlovable, and they have a tendency to engage in self-blame. I would say, just based on what I've seen with his case, he's probably dealing with some level, obviously, of self-control issues, disinhibited behavior. And if you're working with clients that have disinhibited behavior, higher levels of criminality, higher levels of aggressiveness, higher levels of substance misuse, it can get in the way of that person being able to socialize effectively. It could be a factor in risk-taking behaviors, poor decision-making, more irritability, agitation. So these are just a few things I think we'd want to be aware of. Obviously, being aware of the literature on head trauma. There's a lot of literature on social exclusion, a lot of consequences associated with social exclusion, and emotional invalidation. Clearly, he was dealing with some level of emotional invalidation by his mother. And did all of these factors early on in life contribute to problems with intimacy and empathy deficits? So just some things to think about. By no means are these all of them. We didn't really talk about his animal abuse history today, but we could maybe explore that in a future episode. But before we get into the last section, Joe, I was going to talk about in the last section just some general intervention strategies to consider working with anyone.
Yeah, let's go there, Jerrod. I wanted to comment. I love having you on the show to highlight, again, these more extreme cases on the far end of the spectrum. But if a listener is out there thinking to themselves, well, I don't have any Edmund Kempers on my caseload. True. And I just made a few notes here, Jerrod, while you were speaking. But you're likely supervising somebody who experiences cognitive distortions or reduced inhibition or reduced social skills, or who is dealing with impulsivity issues or empathy deficits. Maybe haven't had that triggering event, or maybe it's in smaller doses that they won't manifest like Kemper did. But to your point about interventions, you should still be aware of these factors in either smaller doses or arranged a little bit differently. Because again, a regular listener of the show will do what I just did and say, yeah, I see a lot of what you're describing, or I've come across it in my caseload. So yeah, Jerrod, let's go right to those interventions then as well.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for mentioning that. I mean, yeah, most people will never work with someone to this extreme, but you're probably working with people that have had extensive trauma histories, attachment problems, brain injuries. So again, the more we can learn about all this literature, the better off we're going to be. So through a neurocriminology lens, I like to start early on in life. Again, what are some early health risk factors that are related to potential negative behavior later on in life? Prenatal and postnatal drug and alcohol exposure, tobacco use during pregnancy. A lot of literature on tobacco use during pregnancy and some of the problematic outcomes that this can lead to. By no means am I saying Kemper's mom did this. These are just general things to be aware of. Maternal depression, birth complications, traumatic brain injury, lead exposure at any time in utero early on in life, child abuse. These are early risk factors to be aware of. When we talk about like improving functioning, obviously earlier intervention is key. Working with the family system, helping the family thrive through an attachment trauma-informed lens. But basic things to consider through a positive psychological functioning lens, I think is just important for all of us to be aware of. Helping people develop a better sense of self, focusing on personal growth and empowerment. So like strengths-based approaches, motivational interviewing, all of these things can be very, very helpful. Helping people develop a better sense of autonomy and independence, teaching them positive relationship skills and communication skills and how to resolve conflict without it going into rage control issues. Focusing on attachment. A lot of attachment-based interventions out there. So if you become trauma-informed, you're really becoming attachment-informed de facto, but know that attachment influence our thoughts, feelings, and actions. So just understanding attachment theory, I think, is very, very helpful because the literature points to the fact that people who have more secure, positive, healthy attachment patterns usually grow up and they're in a better position to manage stress. They can regulate their emotions and behaviors more effectively. They typically do better in school. By no means am I saying someone with insecure attachment patterns are going to have all these problems, but if you look at the research, that's kind of what they've found. One thing that we don't talk about in this literature is a topic of mentalization and theory of mind. If you can understand that topic and help clients develop better theory of mind and mentalization, that's a good thing. These relate to perspective taking, empathy, understanding internal mental states of other people. If you can help people promote better theory of mind and better mentalization, it's been linked to having better empathy, better communication skills, better conflict resolution. Lots and lots of literature on those topics. I think it's also very important to understand the topic of parental responsivity. So if any of you are working with parents or expected parents or early childhood development, that's another topic I would highly encourage you to learn about. Basically, it's a positive, responsive parenting interaction style. Very common sense, but teaching parents, encouraging parents to use parental warmth and encouragement and kindness and showing a genuine interest in that child. Obviously, if a child grows up in a home and they feel valued and loved and respected and feel safe, that lays the foundation to healthy brain and body development. On the flip side of that, if a child grows up in a home and they're afraid all the time and they don't trust anyone, these are things that can absolutely dysregulate that child and contribute to a host of issues. So before we wrap up, just general things to consider that can help promote healthy social, emotional development in early childhood and in utero. Having pregnancies free from drugs and alcohol, getting good prenatal care, eating healthy, getting good sleep, staying in contact with healthcare providers. As that child is born and raised in the family, obviously being in an environment that is rooted in love and safety and attachment, helping that child learn how to play effectively and interact with other kids and play development, talking to your kids, making eye contact, helping that child disconnect from the screen, parental modeling. Parents who model healthy behaviors and are self-regulated, typically children grow up and model those behaviors and turn out more regulated. Children that grow up in homes where the parent is constantly yelling and screaming and modeling ineffective patterns of behavior or even modeling criminal behavior, there's a greater likelihood that child may grow up and have some problems. Teaching that child how to face challenges and experiences as they get older and more effectively learning how to name our emotions, label them, make sense of them, helping us learn how to form healthy friendships, developing empathy, developing moral reasoning. These are all things to take into account. This is just my own humble opinion, Joe. Edmund Kemper did not seem to have a lot of those things happen in early childhood. It seems like he had a pretty rough childhood and didn't maybe get modeled a lot of those things. So those are some things to think about, Joe. I know we covered a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I wanted to see if there's any thoughts, comments you have, or anything you want me to go a little bit deeper into.
You have covered the bases and then some, Jerrod. I get the feeling this is going to be one of those episodes that I'll have to go back myself and listen to 2 or 3 times because you were throwing so much great information at us to go back and take note of. I know, among other things, I've told anybody who's willing to listen, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, do yourselves a favor and learn everything you can as to theory of mind. But again, so many great nuggets in here, and again, a great job of using extreme case to highlight some of those day-to-day variables that our listeners are likely seeing in their clientele. Jerrod, I'm really looking forward to our next profile. I know you sent me a long list of subjects, but perhaps we'll just leave the listeners hanging as to who we're going to profile next month. Why don't you give a quick shout out, Jerrod, for your awesome program at Concordia University and even some of the great work you're doing with AIAFS.
You bet. At Concordia, I am the program director for a Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and another emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. And I'm also the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. We are a continuing education training program. All of our trainings now are offered online. We provide trainings to professionals who work in the criminal justice, forensic mental health, human service, legal, and all allied disciplines. And Joe, you and I have done a couple trainings now, so check that out. I know I'll be doing a training with one of my colleagues who's one of the leading experts in the entire world on serial killers. We'll be doing a training a couple months from now on homicidal necrophilia, and we'll be getting into the weeds with a number of other different topics. So appreciate it, Joe. Thank you again for allowing me to chat with your wonderful audience.
I will leave links for both your program at Concordia University as well as the general website link for AIAFS so folks can check out those opportunities and trainings, which really dovetail with so much of what we talk about on this program. Dr. Jerrod Brown, Concordia University. Until next time, my friend.
Thank you so much, my good friend.
A quick break from the show to give a shout out to our friends at AIAFS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. AIAFS is a professional organization dedicated to uniting the forensic communities of criminal justice, education, law, medicine, and psychology. AIAFS is a leader in building relationships within the forensic community, locally and nationally. The mission of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies is to provide quality education, training, consultation, and research in the forensic studies to professionals and students. AIAFS is a leader in connecting members with one another to help facilitate professional growth, increased competency, and awareness in forensic mental health studies. For details as to upcoming training events, webinars, or publications, please visit them at www.aiafs.com. And now, back to the show.
As promised, I have left a link for Concordia University in St. Paul if you want to check out some of Dr. Brown's amazing program work there, as well as a link for AIAFS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. Please check out the great resources that Jerrod has mustered on behalf of his work with AIAFS. Some really groundbreaking stuff. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. If you're interested, visit our website, theparagongroup.llc.com. Look for the tab entitled Shop. Click on that tab to discover all the details you need as to securing your very own Criminologist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, or pen. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
When you look at the sexual homicide triggering factors research, what could trigger an offender to actually commit one of these kind of crimes, or even just a sexually based homicide? Isolation, rejection, feeling ridiculed, low self-esteem, substance misuse has been noted, fantasy development, unresolved trauma, severe mental health challenges. Are there any predispositional factors that are psychological, biological in nature? Unresolved conflict. These are all things talked about in the sexual homicide triggering literature. For him, I think obviously one of the triggering events was those rage control issues with his mom.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.